The whispers followed Katherine Stewart like shadows across the dusty floorboards of Cottonwood Springs' only mercantile store. At 32 years of age in 1878, she was what the townsfolk politely called a confirmed spinster, though less charitable tongues used crueler terms when they thought she couldn't hear. Katherine adjusted her modest bonnet and pretended not to notice the murmurs as she selected a spool of thread, her fingers working with practiced precision despite the sting of being the subject of gossip yet again. "Another wedding dress order, Miss Stewart, Mrs." Hollister asked from behind the counter, her voice carrying just enough for the cluster of young women near the fabric section to hear. Katherine smiled tightly. "Yes, for Martha Jenkins. Her mother requested my services specifically." What Katherine didn't mention was that she'd become the most sought-after seamstress in 3 counties precisely, because no one feared her stealing away potential husbands. A woman her age was considered safely beyond the marriage market, particularly after 2 broken engagements had left her reputation tarnished with whispers of being difficult or particular. "Such lovely work you do, Mrs." Hollister continued with the particular brand of pity that Katherine had grown to despise. "It's a shame you never got to make your own." The bell above the door jangled, mercifully interrupting the conversation as a tall figure ducked through the doorway. The store fell into a sudden hush as the stranger straightened to his full height, dust from the trail still clinging to his dark clothes. His presence commanded attention not from any particular showiness, but from the quiet confidence with which he moved. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of sun-bleached wheat with threads of copper running through it. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-weathered skin, scanned the store before settling on Mrs. Hollister. "I'm looking for Sheriff Miller." "2 doors down, mister," Mrs. Hollister replied, suddenly flustered. "You must be the new deputy we've been expecting." The man nodded once. "Reed Fairchild, just rode in from Arizona Territory." Katherine tried to return her attention to her purchases, but found herself stealing glances at the newcomer. There was something compelling about him, not just his appearance, though he was undeniably handsome in a rugged way, but the careful manner in which he spoke, as if measuring each word before releasing it. As he turned to leave, his gaze swept across the store once more, pausing briefly when it met Katherine's. The slightest smile touched his lips, not the practiced charm she'd seen from traveling salesmen or the leering grins of men who thought a woman her age should be grateful for any attention. This was something else entirely, a simple acknowledgement, as if they were the only 2 people in a crowded room who recognized each other. Then he was gone, leaving Katherine with a strange flutter in her chest that she quickly dismissed as foolishness. The next morning found Katherine in her small shop attached to the house she'd inherited from her aunt. Sunlight streamed through the windows as she worked on Martha Jenkins' wedding dress, her fingers moving with the expertise gained from years of practice. The bell over her door chimed, pulling her from her concentration. "Be right with you," she called, carefully setting aside the delicate lace she'd been attaching. When she looked up, Deputy Reed Fairchild stood in her doorway, looking somewhat out of place among the bolts of fabric and half-completed dresses. "Deputy," she said, smoothing her apron. "How can I help you, Miss Stewart?" he asked, holding his hat in his hands. "Sheriff Miller mentioned you might be able to help me." Katherine raised an eyebrow. "With sewing, I presume?" A smile touched his lips. "Unless you're also secretly the town's best tracker or gunslinger." The unexpected humor caught her off guard, and she found herself smiling back. "I'm afraid my skills are limited to needle and thread, Deputy." "Reed," he corrected. "And that's exactly what I need. Had an unfortunate encounter with a fence post on my ride-in." He produced a worn duster coat with a significant tear along one side. "Sheriff says you're the best." Katherine took the coat, examining the damage. "This won't take long to mend, though I wonder why the deputy needs such a quick repair on a coat in the middle of summer." "Planning ahead," he replied, watching her hands as she assessed the tear. "Nights get cold on patrol, even in summer. And a man learns to take care of the few possessions he has when he lives on the move." There was something about the way he said it, not with self-pity, but with the simple practicality of someone stating a fact that made Katherine look at him more closely. "You've been moving a long time," she asked, reaching for her sewing box. "Most of my life," he admitted. "Army for a spell after the war, then marshal service, now here. And how long will Cottonwood Springs enjoy your protection before you move on again?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, more direct than she typically allowed herself to be with strangers. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither spoke. "That depends," he finally said, "on whether I find a reason to stay." Katherine felt warmth creep into her cheeks and quickly turned her attention back to his coat. "Well, until you decide, at least you'll have a properly mended coat. If you'd like to come back tomorrow, I can wait," he said, settling into the chair she kept for customers. "If you don't mind the company." Against her better judgment, Katherine found she didn't mind at all. As she worked, Reed asked about the town and its people. His questions were thoughtful, focused more on understanding the community than collecting gossip. Katherine found herself sharing insights she'd gained from years of observation: which families feuded, which ranchers were fair to their hands, which merchants could be trusted. "You see a lot from behind that sewing table," Reed remarked. Katherine tied off her thread and snipped the excess. "People don't always notice those they don't consider important," she said, handing him the repaired coat. "It's surprising what you can learn when you're invisible." Reed took the coat, but his gaze remained fixed on her face. "I find it hard to believe anyone could overlook you, Miss Stewart." The simple statement, delivered without flattery or expectation, caught Katherine completely off guard. Before she could formulate a response, Reed reached for her hand. His fingers were calloused but gentle as he turned her palm upward, examining the tiny pinpricks and calluses that marked her as a seamstress. "Hands that create beautiful things should be appreciated," he said quietly. Then, in a gesture that seemed as natural to him as breathing but sent Katherine's heart racing, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. "Thank you for your skill, Miss Stewart." "What do I owe you?" Katherine stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. In all her years, no man had ever kissed her hand, certainly not with the reverence Reed had just shown. "Nothing," she managed to say. "Consider it a welcome to Cottonwood Springs." Reed smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "Then I'll have to find another tier soon so I can properly pay for your services." After he left, Katherine remained standing in her shop, staring at the hand he had kissed. She felt changed somehow, as if the simple gesture had awakened something she'd long thought dormant. Over the next 2 weeks, Reed found reasons to visit Katherine's shop with remarkable frequency. A button that needed replacing. A shirt cuff frayed beyond what a bachelor's rough stitching could salvage. Each time, he insisted on waiting while she completed the work, and their conversations grew longer, more personal. Katherine learned that Reed had lost his parents young, raised by an uncle who taught him to shoot and track but little about how to connect with others. He'd fought for the Union, though he spoke little of those years. She discovered his preference for coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and his surprising knowledge of poetry, gleaned from a dog-eared volume of Wordsworth he carried in his saddlebags. In turn, she found herself sharing parts of her life she rarely discussed: her first engagement, broken when her fiancé discovered her aunt had left her only the house and shop but no fortune. The second ended when the man couldn't accept that Katherine intended to continue her business after marriage. She told him about learning to sew at her mother's knee and how creating beautiful things for others had become both her livelihood and her solace. "You never considered leaving?" Reed asked one afternoon as she repaired a tear in his shirt sleeve. "Going somewhere people didn't know your history?" Katherine paused, needle mid-stitch. "And start again at my age? What would be the point?" Reed's expression grew serious. "Your age," he repeated. "Katherine, how old do you think I am?" The use of her first name, something he'd begun doing recently when they were alone, still sent a pleasant warmth through her. "I wouldn't presume to guess," she replied diplomatically. 37, he said, "and I'm starting over in a new place, again." Katherine looked up, surprised. She'd guessed him younger, despite the lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun. "That's different, is it?" His voice was gentle. "Or is it that you've let this town convince you your life is already decided?" Before she could answer, the shop door burst open and Martha Jenkins rushed in, tears streaming down her face. "Miss Stewart, oh Miss Stewart, it's terrible." Katherine set aside Reed's shirt and hurried to the distraught girl. "Martha, what's happened?" Between sobs, Martha explained that her fiancé, Daniel, had been thrown from his horse while checking fence lines. His leg was badly broken, and the doctor feared infection might set in. The wedding, scheduled for just 10 days hence, would have to be postponed indefinitely. "All the preparations," Martha wept. "And what if he doesn't?" "Hush now," Katherine said firmly, guiding the girl to a chair. "Daniel Cooper is strong as an ox and twice as stubborn. He'll recover." Reed had risen when Martha entered and now stood quietly by the window. "Miss Jenkins," he said, "I came through the Cooper place on my patrol this morning. Your young man was alert and ornery enough to be giving Doc Williams a hard time about staying in bed. That's a good sign." Martha looked up, hope flickering across her tear-stained face. "Truly," Reed nodded. "A man that determined to argue isn't going anywhere anytime soon." Katherine shot Reed a grateful look as she prepared a cup of tea for Martha. By the time the young woman left, considerably calmer, the afternoon was fading into evening. "You handled that well," Katherine said as she returned to Reed's shirt. She needed reassurance more than anything. Reed watched her work, his expression thoughtful. "You ever notice how folks around here come to you with their troubles?" Katherine's hands stilled. "I suppose they do." "It's because you listen. Really listen." Reed moved closer, perching on the edge of her work table. "This town relies on you more than they know." Katherine Stewart. Something in his tone made her look up. The intensity in his gaze caused her breath to catch. "I'm just a seamstress." Reed shook his head slowly. "No, you're the heart of this place. You know every family's joys and sorrows. You create the gowns they marry in, the christening clothes for their babies, the Sunday best they're buried in." His voice dropped lower. "You see them all, but who sees you?" Katherine's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name. Reed, the moment was interrupted by the distant sound of shouting. Reed was on his feet instantly, reaching for the gun belt he'd hung by the door. "Stay here," he said, all softness gone from his voice. Katherine followed him to the doorway, watching as he strode toward the commotion on the main street. 3 men on horseback were causing a disturbance outside the saloon cowhands from the Circle T Ranch, by the look of them, and deep in their cups despite the early hour. From her vantage point, Katherine could see Sheriff Miller emerging from his office, shotgun in hand. Reed approached the mounted men with a calm authority that seemed to radiate from him. "Gentlemen," she heard him call, "might be time to sober up before heading back to the ranch." The largest of the 3 sneered down at Reed. "And who the hell are you to tell us what to do?" "Deputy Fairchild," Reed replied evenly. "And you're disturbing the peace." What happened next unfolded so quickly Katherine barely had time to register it. The cowhand reached for his pistol, but before he could clear leather, Reed had drawn and leveled his weapon at the man's chest. "That would be a mistake, friend," Reed said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the street. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the cowhand slowly raised his hands. "No harm meant, deputy, just having some fun." "Fun's over," Sheriff Miller announced, joining Reed. "You boys can sleep it off in our jail or ride back to Circle T right now without any more stops." The men chose to leave, casting dark looks at Reed as they rode out of town. Katherine realized she'd been holding her breath only when her lungs began to burn. As the crowd dispersed, Reed's eyes found hers across the distance. He nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both reassurance and something more personal that made her heart race. That evening, a knock at her door surprised Katherine. She opened it to find Reed standing on her porch, hat in hand and his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "Deputy," she said, suddenly conscious of her loosened hair and the simple house dress she'd changed into after closing her shop. "I apologize for calling so late," he said. "I wanted to make sure you weren't upset by what happened today." Katherine stepped back, inviting him in. I've lived in Cottonwood Springs long enough to see worse than a few drunken cowboys. Reed entered but remained standing just inside the door. Still, it's not what I would have chosen for you to witness. You handled it well, she said, moving to light the lamp on her small parlor table. Would you like some coffee? Reed hesitated, then nodded. If it's no trouble. As Katherine busied herself with the coffee pot in her kitchen, she was acutely aware of Reed moving around her parlor, examining the few photographs and mementos she displayed. When she returned with 2 cups, he was studying a daguerreotype of a young woman in a high-necked dress, her expression serious as was customary for such portraits. You, he said, not a question but a statement of recognition. Katherine nodded, setting down the cups. My 20th birthday. My father insisted on having it made. Reed studied the image again. Your eyes haven't changed, he said softly, still seeing everything. Something about the way he said it made Katherine bold. And what do you see when you look at me, Reed Fairchild? Reed set down the photograph and turned to face her fully. The lamplight cast half his face in shadow, but his eyes were clear and direct. I see a woman who has convinced herself that her best days are behind her when I suspect they haven't even begun. Katherine's breath caught. At my age, your age, Reed interrupted gently, is a number, nothing more. It doesn't define what you can feel or who you can become. He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. When I first arrived in this town, I saw a woman so busy taking care of everyone else that she'd forgotten someone needed to care for her too. Katherine felt tears threatening and blinked rapidly. You don't know me well enough to say such things, don't I? Reed's thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands. I know you work yourself to exhaustion to meet everyone else's deadlines. I know you listen to their problems and keep their secrets. I know you've given up on certain dreams because this town decided long ago what your place should be. A tear escaped despite Katherine's efforts. Reed reached up and brushed it away with a tenderness that undid her completely. What I don't know, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, is if you could ever see me as more than just the new deputy passing through. Katherine stared at him, scarcely believing what she was hearing. You can't be serious. Reed's expression remained steady. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. But I'm the most fascinating woman I've ever met, he finished for her. Brilliant, compassionate, beautiful, old, Katherine said flatly, pulling her hands away. Too old for what? Reed challenged. For happiness. For a man who sees your worth. For love, the word hung in the air between them, both shocking and thrilling in its directness. Katherine turned away, moving to the window where the darkened street offered no distraction from the tumult of her thoughts. People would talk, she said finally, hating how weak the objection sounded even to her own ears. Reed's footsteps approached behind her. People always talk. The question is whether we give them that power over our lives. His hands came to rest lightly on her shoulders. Katherine closed her eyes, absorbing the warmth of his touch through the thin fabric of her dress. I've spent my whole life moving from one place to another, Reed said quietly. Never staying long enough to put down roots, but something happened when I rode into Cottonwood Springs, something I wasn't expecting. Katherine turned slowly to face him. What? Reed's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. I found someone worth staying for. Before Katherine could respond, Reed raised her hand to his lips, just as he had that first day in her shop. But this time, after pressing a kiss to her knuckles, he turned her palm upward and placed another kiss in its center. My angel, he murmured against her skin. That's what I thought when I first saw you, that someone had finally sent an angel to guide this wandering soul home. Katherine felt as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. All the reasons why this shouldn't happen seemed to fade against the reality of Reed standing before her, looking at her as if she were a revelation. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Reed's smile was gentle. Neither do I. But I think we could figure it out together if you're willing. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, Katherine stood at the crossroads of everything she'd resigned herself to and everything she'd secretly longed for. Then, with a courage she hadn't known she possessed, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The weeks that followed transformed Katherine's life in ways she could never have imagined. Reed courted her openly, unapologetically, despite the whispers that inevitably followed. He brought her wildflowers gathered on his patrols and borrowed books from the town's small library to read aloud on her porch in the evenings. Most shocking to the townsfolk was how Katherine herself began to change. She laughed more freely. She closed her shop precisely at 5 o'clock each day rather than working into the night. She wore her hair in a softer style that Reed particularly admired, and she commissioned a new dress in a shade of blue that matched her eyes, a frivolity she would never have permitted herself before. Not everyone approved. Mrs. Hollister made pointed remarks about age-appropriate behavior, while the pastor's wife suggested gently that Katherine should consider Reed's youth and the natural order of things. Such comments stung, but they lost their power to wound when Reed was beside her, his hand steady at the small of her back as they walked through town, his eyes finding hers across a crowded room with a private smile that made her feel both seen and cherished. On a warm evening in late August, Reed took Katherine riding outside of town. They stopped at a rise overlooking the valley, where cottonwood trees lined the creek that gave the town its name. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Reed helped Katherine from her horse and led her to a blanket he'd spread beneath the largest tree. "I used to wonder why people bothered putting down roots," he said as they sat watching the sunset. "What could be so special about one place that would make a man want to stay there forever?" Katherine leaned against his shoulder. "And now," Reed's arm encircled her waist. "Now I understand. It's not about the place. It's about finding the person who makes anywhere feel like home." He shifted, turning to face her fully. "Katherine Stewart, I came to Cottonwood Springs looking for nothing more than another job, another temporary stop. Instead, I found the one thing I never knew I was searching for you." From his pocket, he produced a small silver ring set with a single pearl. It wasn't elaborate or expensive, but something about its simple elegance brought tears to Katherine's eyes. "I can't offer you wealth or a grand house," Reed said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can promise you this, for as long as I draw breath, you will never doubt that you are loved exactly as you are." Katherine looked from the ring to Reed's face, seeing in it all the hope and vulnerability he usually kept carefully guarded. "Are you certain?" she asked. "I'm still." Reed pressed a finger gently to her lips. "If you say too old one more time, I may have to kiss you until you forget the words entirely." A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside Katherine. "That sounds like a threat I might enjoy, Deputy Fairchild." "Good," Reed said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Because I intend to spend the rest of my life making you forget every lie this town ever told you about your worth." He held up the ring. "Will you marry me, Katherine? Will you make this wanderer's heart a home?" Katherine's answer was in her kiss, a kiss that held all the passion and certainty of a woman who had finally found where she belonged. They were married in October, when the cottonwood leaves had turned to gold and the air carried the first hint of winter. Katherine wore a dress of her own, making not the subdued garment of a sensible bride that the town expected, but a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace that made her look, as Reed whispered when he first saw her, like an angel come to earth. The townspeople of Cottonwood Springs watched with varying degrees of surprise, approval, and in some cases, lingering skepticism. But as Judge Parker pronounced them husband and wife, and Reed bent to kiss his bride with a reverence that brought tears to even the most cynical eyes, something shifted in the collective perception of what was possible. Martha Jenkins, recovered from her own postponed wedding drama and now happily married to a healed Daniel, caught Katherine's bouquet of autumn roses and wildflowers. As the newlyweds prepared to depart for a brief honeymoon in Denver, Martha embraced Katherine tightly. "You've given me hope," the young woman whispered. "Not just for my own marriage, but for what love can look like 20 years from now." Katherine squeezed Martha's hands. "The secret, my dear, is finding someone who sees you, truly sees you, and loves what they see." As Reed helped Katherine into the waiting carriage, his hand lingered on hers. "Ready for our adventure, Mrs. Fairchild?" he asked, his eyes alight with a joy that matched her own. Katherine smiled up at him, feeling younger and more alive than she had in years. With you, always. 5 years later, Katherine sat on the porch of their expanded home. Reed had added 2 rooms and a proper study, where she now designed custom wedding gowns for clients who traveled from as far as Denver to commission her work. On her lap sat their 3-year-old daughter, Emma, whose golden hair and serious blue eyes were so like her father's that it sometimes made Katherine's heart ache with happiness. The sound of hoofbeats announced Reed's return from his duties. Now the sheriff of Cottonwood Springs after Miller's retirement, he dismounted with the same fluid grace that had first caught Katherine's attention years ago. Emma squirmed free and ran to meet him, squealing with delight as he swept her into his arms. "There's my little deputy," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead before carrying her back to the porch. "And there's my angel," he added, leaning down to kiss Katherine with undiminished devotion. Later that night, with Emma asleep and the house quiet around them, Katherine nestled against Reed's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. Settling down with a woman everyone thought was past her prime. Reed's arms tightened around her. "The only thing I regret is that I didn't find you sooner," he said, his voice rumbling beneath her ear. "Think of all the adventures we could have had." Katherine smiled in the darkness. "We're having them now." "Yes," Reed agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "And we'll keep having them until we're both old and gray. And then we'll sit on that porch and tell Emma all about how her father was smart enough to recognize an angel when everyone else was too blind to see." Katherine tilted her face up to his, marveling still at how this man had transformed her life with nothing more than his belief in what they could be together. "I love you, Reed Fairchild." His kiss was both an answer and a promise that some loves come when least expected but exactly when needed, and that it's never too late to begin the greatest adventure of all.